And another Friday, Tim. How are you?
Very well, thank you. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. I'm enjoying the fall weather. I'm enjoying what's happening now outside, and and I'm also quite excited about today's topic on us project on we project, or is it us project managers? We project managers as being influencers. I think that's a great topic.
Yeah, it is. It is. It's one that my students really appreciate because we talk about the word, but we really don't define it explicitly. And without an explicit understanding, we can't really grasp it and schedule it into our work.
Well, before we attempt to define it, should I give a little example from my own experience?
Oh yes. Oh yes. This is story time, and this is the best part of the show.
The first part, yeah, there you go. I years ago, well, over the years, after I left corporate America and went into independent consulting, there were several contracts in which I was selected to assist either the client organization or the vendor organization with some very specific tasks. Now, my contract was eloquently worded such that I had absolutely no power, that is, no ability to direct their staff. I couldn't direct client staff. I couldn't direct vendor staff in terms of what it was they were to do. They had their own management. However, what I found was that in working with staff, by maintaining a level of competence, developing incredible relationships, I found after not too many months, 2, 3, 4 months, that I was actually more influential on their day-to-day work than their own management was. And quite often they would come to me and say, "This is what my manager told me. What do you think?" Not that I wanted to undermine their management, because that was not my intent, but they found that they got much more directive responses from me that helped them on their job. So influence in that case came from relationship and from showing that I knew what I was talking about.
So you actually, in a very interesting way, became a trusted advisor, which is a very, very influential position.
That's a great way of describing it. I should have thought of that myself. In fact, I have a book on my shelf called The Trusted Advisor. But you're right.
So okay, and yeah, I've been influential too, where I've not been part of conversations, and a chief executive would say, "I want you on my team." It's a good ego boost.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I was just in a call today too, and I was there just from an advisory standpoint, and the sales rep was looking at a product and was presenting all the nice things of the product. And it was very curious. They used a certain word that meant basically some components of this product were moved, but he used the word truncated. And it was like, I had to figure out a way to say, did they just take them out, or did they just move them somewhere? And so very gently, not to take the power of the sales rep away, I went in and I said, "Do you mean aggregate there instead of truncate?" And I had this curious look, like a boy who's a little slower than the rest in the room. And I wasn't threatening, but at the same point, he said, "Yeah, that's a good word. Why don't you join our sales team?" Again, it's a good ego boost, but at the same point, you feel like you've done a service to the room and the conversation.
Well, and part of that, and you kind of emphasize it there, part of it is how we come across. If you're directive, then you're just another boss. But if you're inquisitive, if you're questioning, if you're looking after their best interests, if you're truly out there trying to help, and a lot of times I'll just use questions in a way that allows the person to come to their own conclusion.
Yes. You and I are fans of the 1960s television shows, right?
Yeah, we are, but which one are you thinking of?
Columbo.
Columbo, yes. Columbo.
At the end of the show, he always scratches his head and says, I'm a little slower than the rest, but, and it's like you see him putting breadcrumbs for everybody in the room to follow. And he's not doing it in a demeaning manner, but he's doing it in a way to set up the logic and the progression of thought such that it cannot be denied.
So to look at the topic of what we're talking about today in terms of influence, that's probably one approach. But maybe before we get deeper into it, should we attempt a definition of influence and maybe even bring in power or direction, or let's go influence.
Let's do that. Let's play with the definition of influence. And since influence and power are discussed in a similar manner, let's try to be able to differentiate yet figure out how they work together.
Yeah. You want to take the first shot?
Yeah. My sources say to influence is to have an effect on the character development or behavior of another.
So it's to have an effect.
Yeah.
To have an effect, not to direct, but to have an effect.
Yeah, to have an effect, like pulling the weeds out. It actually influences the growth of plants.
And so the opposite, or not, maybe not the opposite, but the corollary to that with the power, how would you define power?
The capacity or ability to either influence or direct. It's sort of like from looking at those two definitions together, power is like the energy that basically is built up enough so that you can do the influence.
I tend to, and I agree with both of those definitions. I tend, probably because I went independent and therefore had no power in terms of being able to direct work or direct staff in terms of what it was that they were doing. But I tend to look at power almost as being positional, whereas influence is being, even in my days as a project manager working for a corporation, I was influenced by people who were on my staff who were many years junior, who happened to have a brilliant idea and presented it to me in a way that I go, that's better than the way I was thinking about it. Let's do that. So you can have influence even if you don't have power. But I think power, in my mind, power is positional. Influence is more, what's the word, referent?
Well, let's actually clarify this. If you study power itself in leadership, power actually is the energy, and it comes from many sources. And you're right, the primary source is your job title or your rank. It's a political thing, but there are other sources of power. How many degrees you have, how many decades you've been working as a project manager. That's powerful. What were the general size of your projects, right? Were they 1 million, 20 million, $100 million projects? That's power. That is cash that you can use to make things happen in other areas.
So I'm a young project manager listening to us right now. My first project, how much power do I really have?
Probably not a lot.
Probably not
and
a lot.
Not a lot. But again, let's face it too. There are other powers like charisma and charm that you've been developing since you were 4 years old.
Yeah.
How to get an extra piece of candy from mom and dad. How about referent power? How do you define referent, Merv?
I think that comes again, much of what you were describing before, my degrees, my experience, the totality of my experience in terms of size, perhaps, of projects. I think there's a power that comes with that that's not necessarily part of my position, but it's part of what I have done. And so people look at that experience, or people look at that credential and say, this guy or this gal has something going on here. I better pay attention.
Okay. So power is power, but it can come from different sources. And even though you think that you're moving in as a very green project manager, you may have sources of power you haven't thought that you could actually pull from.
And I think that's where I was going when I asked you that question for a new project manager on their first project. If you don't have the power except position and it's your first one, then you probably need to rely on those other avenues of influence in order to make your mark and have people follow you in a leadership style that can get the job done.
Yeah, one of the sources of referent power is actually self-leadership. It's really weird. We learn this when we learn to be leaders, right? If you want to be a leader, you have to practice on leading yourself because it helps you understand how people respond to leadership, right? Your self-awareness and emotional intelligence, you treat yourself as if you're treating others. Now, by the very nature of doing that with yourself and figuring out how to lead yourself, people are naturally attracted to you.
Well, and that makes a lot of sense. I've worked with some very, and I'll say powerful technical people. And when I say powerful, I mean their technology knowledge was second to none. But when they presented in a meeting or were asked a question, they were so introverted or so shy or so lacking in communication skills that they couldn't get their point across very well. And so therefore were thought less of. And so their power that came from their experience was lessened by the fact that they lost it in inability to influence because of their demeanor and that sort of thing.
So I totally agree with you. And there is a course of action we can take, no matter what our perception or our actual power are, that we can use to grow our source of power. And what's nice is these things, when you leave a job or a company, you take them with you. This is what I try to impress on my students. You know, if you're going to grow your power, grow the power that you can put in a backpack and take with you wherever you go.
Oh, absolutely. And this is, again, I'm speaking to the newer project manager, although seasoned project managers can learn from this as well. And that is that it's one thing to have positional power, but it's another thing to develop those influence skills right from when you begin your career, perhaps even before that. If you're in college and you're working with a study group, you're developing influence in terms of how you work on your next paper together or whatever, but you want to be able to develop those kinds of influence skills even before you attain the position of power.
Yeah. And again, we can go into this in other sessions, but I remember my one of my teammates when I was very young in project management said, "Tim, we're going to call you Dr. Spin because you make everything sound good and it's not good." I said, "No, I'm actually seeing it from a different perspective and I'm offering that to you." And they say, "No, you're just spinning this up." And I thought about that for a while and I thought influence actually is a set of skills that can be used for good or bad.
Well, they are. And just before we kind of get into that discussion, you just reminded me of something that happened on a project I'm working right now, where my partner and I are seasoned consultants. We've been doing this for a while. And he was in a meeting and he offered something and he said, "Here's this side, but then there's this side." And the client CIO person took him aside after the meeting and said, "I just want you to tell me what the best way to go. I don't want to consult me this side or this side. Give me what you know." And so he was able to influence in such a way that the CIO actually came and said, "I know you know the answer, and I know you're trying to be very consultative with me, but just tell me. And if I disagree, I'll tell you I disagree." But there are times when you just need to use your influence in a way that doesn't start with "it depends."
Right. It depends is no influence at all.
Right. Exactly. But in terms of what we're talking about from an influence point of view, in your experience or perhaps in your observation, do you think influence becomes a natural response, or do you think it is a natural response, or do you think it's contrived or perhaps planned ahead of time?
I was thinking about this. early on in my career, it was a planned event and it was very structured. I wouldn't say it ever became a natural reaction for me, but I think I took an explicit set of activities and made it tacit. I turned it into muscle memory, so it became a natural reaction. This is just how I work. I like to hear other people's thoughts because it makes my thoughts a little bit bigger. I like to hear the decisions people are making because then I can sort of predict the type of decisions they're going to make. And if I'm slower to give my opinion out, I get more information in. So it started off very planned and something I could follow in my head, like ding, 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 right? But at the same point, making it simple and practicing it seemed to make it, quote unquote, natural. It became a habit.
Yeah, I can see that. I can, and probably my own experience is very similar. And I'm thinking that probably the most prevalent situation a project manager can get into is perhaps going into the weekly status meeting where you have to kind of divulge where you are in progress to your client or to your sponsors. And so often I would sit there for an hour before the meeting and I would say, if they ask me this, I'm going to react this way or respond. I think I prefer the word respond than react. If they ask me this, I'm going to be ready with this response. And so it was very much planned. But after a while, it's like you're saying, I don't think about brushing my teeth when I brush my teeth in the morning. Often I plan my day while I'm brushing my teeth in the morning. That becomes sort of a natural response.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, and it's funny because you talking about that and then talking about the CIO. There are times when I'm going into critical situations. Either I know there's a lot of conflict or there's a dilemma or something else, and I have a precise opinion. I give that a lot of thought. Can I actually, do I have conviction behind my opinion? And then I say, okay, here's the best way to influence within this group of people. Here's what their culture accepts. Here's what the individual behavior accept. And this is a strategy. And if that doesn't work, here's a strategy. And if everything goes south, here's a recovery. and I've learned that preparing, especially in international groupings and meetings, this has actually saved me many, many, many times.
Well, and I think having that conviction, by the way, in my experience, that conviction comes with experience over time, right? So
Yeah.
as you develop those convictions in terms of what it is that you're offering to the situation, I think that conviction is much more convincing than planning in the first place.
Oh yeah.
Because it's heartfelt. It's in the moment. It's
that's why. Yeah, that's why. When Cicero was talking about how you move and change the attitudes of people, you don't just use logic and ethics. You use ethos. I'm sorry. You use pathos. You use your emotions because it speaks to a lower part of the individual, speaking to the limbic system.
Well, and I'll tell you another thing. Having now been like your early years a planner, and then eventually being able to work it into the conversation, the influence part, I now am watching for especially less seasoned project managers or less seasoned technicians. I watch for that planned response because then I'm feeling like I'm being manipulated sometimes. And sometimes that planning is almost like shifting the tides in such a way that whoever I'm speaking to, in this case me, if that person is speaking to me, in this case, I'm going to influence, I'm planning my influence to move them in that direction. And so at some point, you also have to be kind of aware of that and say, no, I'm sticking to my guns. I'm not going to let them influence me incorrectly because they happen to have thought something out ahead of time. And so there are those ways. So you have to be careful, I think, also in terms of too much planning makes it seem like it's too stilted and therefore it can considered as almost being manipulative.
Yeah, it comes off as artificial.
Yeah.
It comes off as that's them pulling a tool out of their bag instead of that's them, that's their character.
Yeah.
And it's something I can see in the individual. Yeah, there you have a really good point there. So here's the question. You talked about influencing sideways and up and down stuff. Let's dig into that. When did you start looking at influencing not just your teams, but your peers and eventually your executives? And how did you go about approaching that?
That's a great question. I think from a peer, let me begin with the peers first. The peers is a little easier because you come together on an ad hoc or perhaps a specific cadence basis. And as you come together, you're all working towards the same thing. So let's say I'm a team lead amongst my peer team leads. You learn to, in those situations, to do the give and take. And I think if you can give away as much as you, maybe I'm saying that wrong, if you can take from them as much as you try to give into the conversation and understand it and just really work with everyone, understanding everyone's ideas, in that perspective, if you develop those peer relationships, then the peer influence becomes much easier. And I think it goes both two ways, both between you and the peer to you. So in that situation, I'll let you respond to your own question before I get into the responding up or influencing up.
It's funny because I read a simple book, I forget the author, when I was just out of college. Everything you need to know you learned in kindergarten. Right?
Yeah.
And out on the playground, we learn and we evaluate by how that give and take happens. This is a natural behavior of individuals. And it's fascinating to see people in a room, in a conversation or a meeting or decision, actually using those evaluation tools they had when they were 5 or 6 or 7.
I'm smiling because I remember a comedian talking about if you only had one child, then you're not really a parent because that child has no peer to deal with. And so therefore that child is being, obviously he was being comedic. But if you think about it, if you're kind of trapped at home as a only child, and please, I'm not demeaning only children here, but you don't learn some of those basic skills unless you're on the playground bloodying someone else's nose or sharing a sandwich. Because
Exactly. And we have to realize that this is something that every human being has to learn. And some of the lessons are hard. And that's the hardest thing about being a leader and a manager, as well as being a parent.
Yeah. And you also asked about learning to influence up. And I think this was a harder learned lesson.
Mm-hmm.
Because number one, I did not understand at the point that I had to influence up, that I was in fact looked upon as someone who could influence up. If you understand what I'm saying, I did not have enough understanding of my own ability that I felt that I could influence up. But when I was granted permission to influence up, I found that as long as I maintained a humility about my advice or my options or my, the things that I was talking about, or as long as I maintained always based on my competence, then my influence up was always regarded highly. And I was often asked in situations, sometimes very difficult situations, what I thought. That didn't mean that my advice was always accepted, but it was always requested.
Yes. My experience is a little bit different, and it was hard earned. Chief information officer, again, executives are very dangerous. And I learned that day that communication is sharing information two ways, whether it's intentional or unintentional. And the chief information officer stopped us in the hallway and she said, "Thank you for your advice." I'm saying, "What? Okay, great." She said, remember last week when you talked about these other projects that you have going on, and this one is automating a lot of what IT is doing for us right now. I looked at my numbers and I can actually let go of up to a third of my IT staff.
Ouch.
And I'm thinking, I'm unintentionally influencing. I have to be very careful. I am now responsible for the lives and the outcome. I'm sure, they were able to recover. This has been 15 or 18 years, but I've carried that memory to this day on the fact that you are influencing. If you are perceived as an expert, people are listening to you and acting on your words.
That's true, but I think in that situation, if I can relieve you of your still 15 years later feeling of remorse, you were asked to do a job, and that was to offer advice based on the data and the observations you had. And so how they acted upon that advice when they accepted it was up to them. You did your job, and then they did theirs. So I wouldn't feel, I mean, yes, you feel bad for the person, but I wouldn't feel badly about the decision that I helped them make because of things that I saw and data that I analyzed.
Thank you for those words, Merv. I appreciate those. So these are interesting conversations.
Yeah.
Influence is a little more nuanced than we thought, and it's a lot more powerful than we may realize.
It is. I can tell you that I was in a situation one time where I was consulting. That is, I was brought on as part of the project management office for a very, very large government organization. And it was time for them to implement a system. And the CIO took his advisors, internal and external. I was one of the external advisors, but nonetheless, there was about 5 or 6 of us. And he went around the table. He bought us lunch, which was great, but he went around the table and he asked each person, do we go? Is it time to go live? Is the system ready to go? To a person, they all said yes. He got to me and I said no. And he looked at me like, why was I the single outlier? And I labeled about 5 or 6 different reasons why I felt that we were not ready to put this system out to 10,000 end users. And the bottom line was the code was still too dirty, meaning that we hadn't yet teased out all of the defects that we should have been teasing out. And looking at all of his advisors, looking at me at the cost of several $1 million, he made the decision not to go. Now, I was putting my career on the line. Basically, if I was wrong and made that decision and cost the organization several $1 million for the delay, then I was obviously out of a job or out of a contract. But in this situation, because of my intuitive approach, having been in the trenches with those people who were testing, I could come up with several very concrete reasons and back them up as to why I felt it was not time to implement. And he accepted that. Why did he accept that? Because he had dealt with me for 6 or 7 months prior to this. And he therefore knew and understood that I was not going to do anything for effect or for drama or for whatever, that I was giving him the best of what I understood was the situation at the time. And so I felt that was one of the probably most devastating aspects of my ability to influence, but it was necessary.
So this is really interesting. How do you know when to use influence? Like in that place, you knew that you were going to stick out and you were going to say something that would be contentious in that room. And you and I agree, this is tacit. This is something that we do through habit. How do you know when to apply that influence?
Let me ask you that question again. Let me ask you that question back in a different way. How do you know when not to use influence?
Oh, when somebody, and I have the answer for that from experience. When somebody is asking me to take responsibility for a decision that's not my decision to make.
That's a good one. Yeah.
That's something measurable. It's smart. And it's something that I can say, you know what? That's not my position to say that. That's, it's not just rank. It's, we have a group with formal roles, but we also have a group with informal relationships. And
Yeah.
I'm not going to step beyond that.
Well, and so back to your first question, how do I know when to influence? Part of that comes to degree of consequence. In this situation, had that system been rolled out in its present condition to 10,000 end users, we would have had a far more devastating effect on the field, on the government offices, field workers, than had we just delayed and made it better before we rolled it out. So the dire consequences in my mind, I could feel for those people who were not only learning a new system, but were learning a new system that had bugs, a lot of bugs. Now, I just came out of a meeting this morning where we were asked to make some decisions on some procurement items. And I was asked in my situation, I was asked how I would feel about something. And I said, however you guys want to go, I'm okay either way, because it is inconsequential in this situation, whether we do A or whether we do B. And so in that case, I didn't have to apply my influence, although probably my response influenced theirs a little bit. But I felt in some cases, it's just up to them to make the decision. And I don't have to get involved in every single situation to provide influence.
That defines your boundaries.
Yeah.
And it's not just helping make good decisions. It's helping build an understanding in the group that this is what my role is. This is how I am defined.
Yeah. And let me give you another example that's not quite as dire as the first one I gave. Same thing, I was working on a very large project and I was advising the states, in this case, another state agency. I was advising their user acceptance test group in terms of the process and the way to go about testing. We had a very difficult lead on the state side. This person was difficult to work with, not only from her own team members, but from the vendor community and from me personally. And the word got up to the executive sponsor about this one single individual who basically was 5 or 6 levels down from the executive sponsor role. And she called myself and her one of her leads into her office and said, I'm going to fire this person. Not fire them from state service, but fire them from the project. And my first reaction was, yes, that was in my mind. Mm-hmm. My second reaction after I thought about it very quickly was, yes, she's difficult to work with, but she knows so much. And so therefore I began to work with the executive sponsor in a way that convinced her to leave this person in place, perhaps deal with her on a personal basis, on a one-on-one basis, but leave her on the project. And she reluctantly accepted my influential response to her. And again, this didn't have as much dire consequences, but I felt for the good of the project at where we were at that time that we needed to maintain this relationship with this difficult person. And so there's times that you just influence because it's for the best of the project, not because it's got anything to do with people or anything else, but because you have to move forward.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Very good. Yeah, I've had the same experience where I've been asked to justify whether or not this person belongs on the project. And I connect back to my personal values. And I made a long decision a long time ago that said my personal values are going to support the objectives of the project, or I cannot be, I can't have integrity. And so I basically structured all my logic and all my arguments around, does it stand to my personal values? And, it's funny, aligning these things like influence and other things with ethics and morals sort of works once you do that heavy work up front.
Well, and then going back to our previous conversation, then if you align it with your values and ethics, you are less likely to have to sit there and plan your responses.
Exactly.
They become much more part of who you are.
exactly. It makes this influencing more natural. It actually connects you closer to the people around you, and they're not so surprised
Yeah.
by your comments.
Well, and even in that last example, I could have gone the other way had I believed in my heart of hearts that her disruptive behavior was more disruptive to project progress than her knowledge was. So I could have gone the other way just as easily. So again, it had to do with what are the outcomes we're striving for, not necessarily allowing personal feelings to get in the way of whatever that decision was. So I think influence comes again, as we talked about, for many things. In this situation, it was because the value I placed on getting done on time and within budget.
So this leads us to an interesting situation. This comes from one of my students, and it took me a few minutes to figure out why this student was asking this question. But they started off by asking, hey, Tim, do you need power to influence? Or does power get in the way of influencing sometimes?
Oh, that's easy. Yes. Yes. Power. No, I shouldn't kid around. You don't need power to influence. I think our discussion for the last 30 minutes has probably, I'm hoping, has convinced our listeners of understanding that there's other things in your character, in your demeanor, in your convictions, in your values, in your ethics that allow you to influence without necessarily having power. And I'm referring now to positional power. But if yours, let's say, if you're the CIO and you have a vision and you have consulted all of your managers in terms of what this vision might look like, then you make up your mind. At that point, it's very helpful to have the power of your position to say, okay, we're implementing my vision this way. I've had all your input, and this is my decision. Whether the CIO accepts all of the input or accepts some of the input or accepts none of the input. It's helpful to be a person of power in that situation to be able to move the vision forward. So that's an it depends answer, I know, but that's kind of
no, and that's the problem. These scenarios that the students draw are almost always situational. They always have some context that you have to consider. And when we get into those big decisions as an executive, we have to realize the ramifications. And that's why we may not use influence so much. We use directive. Here are the directions. Here's how we're going to go.
Yeah. But how did you answer your student? Did you get a chance to?
I didn't hedge. I said it can, if you're not careful. I took the ethical path, right? That said, if I say something as an executive, whenever you say something in a room as an executive, it's the direction. There is no influence. Yeah. It is, this is the way it's going to go. Influence in my world or in my perception says that I change the course a little bit. And as an executive, that's not your job to change the course. It's your job to tell the people who are changing the course, this is our destination. Yeah. Figure out the best way to get there.
Well, and I think that's a great response because, from your students' point of view, I assume they're up and coming aspirational project managers, but you get into those situations where, as you were saying, from that executive role, it's like you can say something and it suddenly becomes a directive, even if you didn't mean it. And I ended up in a situation I found out yesterday on the project that I'm working on, that the CIO, the deputy CIO, who is basically the main executive sponsor of the project that we're consulting to, likes to be challenged. Likes to have his ideas challenged. So armed with that information, I now have permission to offer up even more influential thoughts based on my experience than perhaps I otherwise might have had I known, well, this guy just made a statement, therefore that's the way he's going to go, period. He's now given me permission. Now, he didn't, but I found out that he likes to be challenged. So now I have an avenue where I can truly use not my position, but my experience as an influence to him to help him make hopefully better decisions.
Let me give you something in comparison. This student was from a culture that applies a lot of respect to elders and people in authority. And he was asking in a sideways manner, my culture and my values say you don't do this. And how do you figure out a way to provide an information such that they can adopt it, or at least they can consider it. And this is how nuanced influence can really get. And I'm glad we're going this direction, because you've had one experience and one nuance, and I've had another. And it's like, yeah, from a cultural standpoint, we have to realize that influence may be the same, but it's applied in different manners. And with that in mind, I'm thinking about an engineering student has been given their first management position, and how do I make my statements in the hallway such that I don't ruin my first real management job.
Well, in that situation too that you just cited, it would be difficult for you or I to advise, not being from that culture. I mean, it would be difficult for us to put ourselves in her or his position, in terms of how it is that they need to respond to their executive level manager. But I think if you were to answer that person in a way, you might be able to tease out some ideas by asking a lot of questions, and then letting them come to their own conclusion as to how they can approach their management. I understand culturally, yes. I worked with several people from cultures where you don't question management, even if you know that management's decision probably is not the best one.
Yeah, especially Asia and Far East Asia. You build your influence, not necessarily through your professional relationship, but through your interactions with the individuals, and you build that trust. And it takes a long time, a lot of cups of coffee and a lot of snacks and desserts.
And that's where I appreciate, I did a project a while ago, oh, this is years ago now, in Puerto Rico. And I love the fact that every meeting started with about 10 minutes of just pleasantries over a cup of espresso and a cookie. And it was just something that was just made for a much more pleasant environment. It allowed you to kind of check each other out in terms of what kind of person the other one is. And then you were able to go from there in terms of whether or not you could influence a situation or you could not.
Well, let me give you two perspectives, okay? And these I have experienced, okay? Number one, North Central United States. Everything's go, 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 go. Now. And so your influence is going to have to fit somehow into that model where you're prepared with the logic and the support they need right now for any decision they have in hand. And then over in Milan and Como, Italy, like you said, you're not going to talk business. You're going to just talk about the human experience. What's the weather like? How are these things? Because again, relationship is almost more important. You're making a commitment and an obligation with somebody and a company even that has no context. And how do we do that? The way we've been doing it for 10,000 years. You share food, you share drink, you sit down, and like you said, you get that sense of how people behave in a public environment.
And by the way, I didn't, and having learned that in Puerto Rico, and then some of that also on a project I worked on in Hawaii, I brought some of that to my mainland projects because it's not all hustle bustle, Gantt charts, schedules, deadlines, dollars, all that kind of stuff. Because sometimes to achieve deadlines, dollars, Gantt charts, etc., you need to develop those relationships and spend some time working those relationships, and therefore become more influential, such that people will want to please each other and make sure that their part of the project is done timely and done well.
Yeah, one of my first training coaches, a guy who actually made his money teaching consulting, and he's a great author, but he's incredible master at standing up in front of groups and being able to convey information. He said, you build the relationship first, and the best way to build a relationship, and he was speaking back in 2005, even if you're working remotely, you start off the conversation by saying, wow, look out the window, it's a beautiful day. I don't see a cloud in the sky and the wind's nice, and look at that hummingbird right in front of me. What do you know? It number one, it sets the stage, and it creates that sense that something is going on, so people pay attention to you. But at the same time, it shows the type of person you are and how the students can relate with you.
You made me smile because I thought of exactly a situation like that on a phone call years ago. When I started a conversation like that, it was the week after Christmas, and I casually, as part of the kind of introduction conversation, told this person that I had just on Christmas Day cut my lawn. Now, it was unusual for us here in New Mexico as well to do that, but I had cut my lawn that Christmas Day. It's probably the wrong thing to do because the person was in New York. It was 30 below zero and there was snow everywhere. So that did not help. You have to kind of understand those situations too.
Yeah. Go ahead.
You asked the question before in terms of, do we need power to influence? And there was a second part. Does power sometimes get in the way of your ability to influence?
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah. It really does. Tim's an expert. I have nothing to provide Tim. If I'm perceived as an expert, I'm not going to get any information from them. How dare I question any Tim's ideas? And all of a sudden it introduces halo bias. If Tim's an expert, boom, he knows everything. Why should I contribute? Tim is an executive consultant. How do I talk to somebody who's comfortable and natural speaking with executives that have personal relationships on a regular basis with 8 and 9 figure people? How do I, compare to Tim? And it's like, oh dear. It's like, I don't like to give directions. I like collaboration because it always results in a better idea. And so I've consciously built a habit around influence by not demeaning myself, but resetting expectations on how communication works with me, and also how to engage with me on a professional basis. This is something I've had to do very carefully in my classes.
Yeah, I had a situation not unlike that, but one time I had a boss. So everything was a directive. Everything was his way or the highway. And so, after a while, it didn't take many months, several of us were ready to leave. Not that we felt that our opinions were so great, but it was like, you just felt like you were just a cog. You were just
the word for that is disengagement.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm not a person who easily disengages, but he just sucked the life out of any creativity or responsiveness that we might have had.
Yeah, and I can tell, like you, I can tell immediately if somebody has not had any training or mentoring in management or leadership. And if somebody has a business degree, how dare they be so callous not to demonstrate emotional intelligence and just insert a little self-respect as well as respect for others in the room. That's a mark of somebody who, number one, cares about the work, and number two, really cares about, you know, the participation they have and the expectation of their participation in the results.
So a while ago, we kind of took a glancing blow off another question that was kind of twirling in my mind, and that is, when did you first learn that you could use influence? I know we kind of touched on that, but did we really dig into it at all?
You know, it was my comedic nature when I was a child. I realized I could make people laugh, and I could make people happy, and I could get people to relax in a room. I'd say something that was, you know, it wasn't off color, it wasn't off topic, but it seemed to be a little incongruous. And it took people by surprise, and they said, wow. And it sort of lowered the tension in a group when you're in a new group. I'm not a comedian by any way, but I've since evolved this concept of influence into, you know, like you said, servant leadership, creating an environment where people can actually relax, let their guard down, and do that. And it seems to have been, like we talked about, something just natural that I built. It's a survival strategy that I built into a professional strategy. How about you?
I was, again, smiling when you were using that as a child, because I think I learned mine probably too, was to influentially extract money from my grandmother.
Yep.
But you know, after I thought about this years later, when I look back, when I brought my own children to visit her, she was now a great grandmother, and watching her react to my children, I wonder if she was influencing me as opposed to me influencing her.
Exactly. I'm the same way. In sharing dessert, you know, there's enough pie for two people. And I had like three sisters, and there was always an argument of who's going to get the bigger piece, because we never cut pieces. And mom looks over, she's doing something else in the kitchen. She looks over, I said, okay, one of you cut, the other choose. And then she went back to work. And it's like, wow, that is really clever, mom. Even when I was young, I was thinking, huh.
Yeah.
And parents, when they are aware of their influence, can be really, really motivating in establishing these behaviors. Now, we can do the same thing. This is the beautiful thing. This model works in our projects, especially early in the project, when you're able to not just be influential, but use it as a teachable moment, not wearing it on your shoulder or something, but sneaking it in and saying, you know, here's a great way I figured out how to do this. You know, you don't have to go out of your way to say you're teaching, but do it in such a way that people notice.
Well, and that when I started off our podcast today with that story of how I was working in these large departments and had no positional power at all, but I had more influence than the client staff's own management. Part of that came from the fact that it wasn't so much that I stealthily put something in, but there were some things that I did that were very, very obvious that they had never been exposed to. For example, towards the Christmas break, we decided to come together as a team and hold a celebration. Well, as a contractor into that department, I was not allowed, even though I'd already won the contract, we're already been well into the contract itself. I was not allowed to spend money over a certain amount of money on over a certain dollar amount on anybody. But I thought, you know, we're having this great get together, and I've gotten to know each person. There's 20 people on the team. I know each person now. I'm going to go to the gag store and I'm going to buy a little $3, $5 gag gift for all of those people. And I'm going to present it in a ceremony, kind of a fictitious ceremony kind of thing. I got more response, more laughter, more camaraderie from that simple 1 hour long ceremony and silly little gag gifts that were suited to each person's personality, that for the next 6 months, I could do no wrong. And so you can do things that are overt also to influence the situation.
That actually reminds me, thank you for that, Merv, because that reminds me that influence and motivation too seem to be best done when you're working at the individual level. You're speaking to the individual. It's not, you don't influence a group, you influence the members of the group. You're speaking at the personal level.
Yeah, absolutely. And it just, you know, you think about that, and from then on in this experience, I could almost direct. I didn't direct, but you could almost direct and they would just do anything. It was a $3 gift. It was just silliness. But the fact, and like you said it well, the fact that they were individually attended to was so meaningful to them.
Yeah, it wasn't so much as a reward, but it was a recognition that they were unique individuals and you saw them as such.
Yeah. So in the 3 or 4 minutes that we have left, I'm going to ask that age-old philosophical question. Tim, can we manage without influence?
Oh, that's hard. I was just thinking about that. And I was thinking, you know, I could manage just through direction. I use my spreadsheet. I tell people what to do. I measure. And then I can say, by the data, we need to do this, 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 and this. And this is what I think. Yeah, but then again, you know, we had that conversation earlier today where it's, you know, we're sharing information unintentionally. And what we're saying is, I'm speaking at a certain level, which means entirely professional. And if you want to influence me, you're going to have to speak entirely professional. So in a roundabout way, we are using influence, even when we don't intend to.
And that's true. And I think if we can understand managing without influence, I think we're almost into sort of a dictatorship or a tyrant kind of model, because the staff has no opportunity to improve, to self-direct, to offer their own observations. And as a result of that, it's much like the example I used earlier. They become disengaged. And so, yeah, you're managing, you're going through the motions, but you're really not, well, first of all, you're not having fun. But secondly, you're probably missing deadlines. You're probably going over budget. You're probably doing a lot of things wrong because you are not using that relational influence that works so much better.
Yeah, at the very at the very best, you're getting the work done, the end. And it's not going to be stellar work.
I once had a lead on one of my projects where one of the things that we did back then was we would, at the end of the week, we would go through, we'd talk to every person. We would have them tell us how many hours they put on which task and how many hours remained per task. And it was the idea was that you wanted to understand your percent complete, you wanted to understand your progress. And so I would have my lead go around to her staff, her team, and get that information. Well, what she would do is she would wait till the people left their desk and she would put a piece of paper on their chair, meaning that when they came back, they would fill in by task, how many hours this week, how many hours left. And we were just getting arithmetic back. Always coming back was paper with just a mathematical thing. And it was interesting how sometimes you'd end up with 40 hours left on a task and 80 hours later, you still weren't complete. And so I asked her what she was doing. This is how I found out. So she was not trying to influence at all. She was trying to manage, but she was not trying to influence at all. And so I said, you know what? You need to sit down with each person and you need to look at the whites of their eyes and ask them the questions directly. It's amazing how much better information we got when she talked to every single person and related that, and therefore could influence just by her, even just by shifting in her chair, she could influence a person's response.
Yeah,
Totally.
it is. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. Putting that human component, putting that relationship component changes the whole perspective of work.
Well, I hope we have helped our listeners today understand influence and how they can be part of that as part of their projects. What do you think, Tim? Did we pass the grade today?
I think we did indeed. If nothing else, this was an entertaining conversation, very enlightening for me to participate. I appreciate it.
And myself. I mean, I really enjoy understanding from other people's experience how they've been able to get through their own project management experiences and then relate those to others.
Yeah.
So if people wanted more relatable information on this or other topics, can they find you somewhere on the internet?
Yeah, LinkedIn. I'm one of a couple or three Timothy Jeromes, but you can find me locally here in New Mexico. It's very easy to look me up. And for you, Merv?
Same thing, LinkedIn, either through my name, Merv Jersak, or my company name, People First Project Management. And I also have a website where I've got a lot of blog posts and a lot of information that people can just read for their learning pleasure. And it all comes from hard-fought experience.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. What a gift you've given us. Thank you so much, Merv.
Well, I appreciate all that you are offering us as well. Thank you, Tim.
Enjoy yourselves, everyone, and we will talk to you soon.
Next week.
Thanks again.